this evening. Now, when you first probably saw this flyer, I'd be really interested to know what you thought, reactive movement, because that means so many different things to so many different people. But I want to give you some history and some background as we move forward about what that means to us, and what hopefully that will mean to you as you move forward with your training and working with students and athletes and others in your particular domain. I can assure you, because I was able to put the list together of people in this room, that there is something from today's seminar that you'll be able to use or build upon within your particular domain as you work and go throughout your career. So, welcome, and I'd like to start talking a little bit about me and then talk a little bit about my co-presenter, Mr. Baker over here. So I am a professor. We do have our biography, very short biographies, on the second page of your handout that gives you a little bit of information about our background. I can tell you that while I do have a doctorate, and let's see, my first higher ed class I taught was in '91, so if I do my math right, this is my 27th year in higher ed. I know I only look 25, but been at this for quite some time. But really, I've also was a elementary PE teacher and coached for a number of years, middle school PE teacher. I've coached football, basketball, baseball, track and field. A whole body ago, I was a college pole vaulter. I do have kids that are involved in youth sports, which I spend a lot of time coaching. One's a football player, 16-year-old, another one's a soccer player who plays U11, or U12 right now. So I'm a coach and a dad, and that's really who I am first. And I just happen to have been so passionate about movement and teaching and those kind of things that I wanted to learn a lot more. So I wound up with a couple doctorates, and the rest is history. So when I'm talking to you, I want you to understand, I'm not talking, even though we will spend some time today talking about theory and some complex things like that, I'm just a teacher. I'm just a good old PE teacher and coach, and that's where I come from. That's who I am, and that drives me. So I'm not pretentious at all. You're very lucky that I don't have my flip-flops on and shorts. I decided to dress up a little bit. In fact, I have a sign on my door that said, "Happiness is a worn-out flip-flop." Those of us who live in Florida or nearby know that that, in fact, has a lot of meaning. Now, I can tell you about my colleague. He's got a lot of initials. He's earned all those. But here's something I also want you to know. KB, Kevin Baker, I did not know a year ago. However, I knew about him. As a dad, hearing about what he was able to do, as a professional, hearing about some of the other things he was accomplishing with athletes, I was pretty impressed. What was I impressed with? I was impressed that if you look at the number of people, he's even humble, and his bio doesn't really tell you the number of people he has helped advance and move forward in their respective sports and their physical activity careers. He's helped a lot of people get to college and to a lot of professional level sports and worked with things. Even his own son played in the NFL with the New York Jets. So he has a lot of history and background in that area. So he kept coming up to me. So for about the last 5 years or so, his name would pop up in various circles and different things would happen. And last fall, my son, who was a sophomore football player, I was talking to the star running back at Gulf Breeze, where my son goes to school, and I was talking to his dad, and his dad kept saying, "You've got to get out and meet KB. You've got to get Ethan, my son, in with KB." And I was like, what's great here? He's a strength and conditioning coach. Well, I work at a university. I've got hundreds of people in strength and conditioning that can get them stronger and can do those other kind of things. And I was just like, there must be something special here, because I can go down the list of the star athletes and people doing well here, and it seems like so many of them in volleyball and soccer and baseball and work with KB. So I gave him a call last fall, and I said, all right, I said, my son is interested in getting bigger and stronger and those kind of things. And then so my son went out there, and yes, he got bigger and stronger because he's a very accomplished strength and conditioning coach. So those things happen, bigger, stronger, a little faster. Some of those kind of things happen for Ethan. But then he said, hey, I want you to come out, and I want Ethan to experience this movement training that I'm doing. Kind of vague and that kind of stuff. And so I went out and I watched. And I paid attention. And then I reflected on a lot of the stuff that I'm reading and interested in about improving players, improving their performance. And what I know, and I'll come back to this as we move forward, what I know is that there are those things that we call just athletic, or we say that they have these intangible qualities, or we have these other factors that in fact I assume were just somebody had it or they didn't. But what I realized is that those of us in sports science really trying to figure out what made those people who had those intangible qualities special. There were certain characteristics they had. We studied that, we looked at it. And there are certain things that those athletes can do or do that others don't. Well, what I was really pleased to find was that the movement training that he was doing was a little bit different than some of the other agility training and other movement training things we were dealing with, but I was noticing that those are the athletes that had that extra piece. And so I thought, wow, this is pretty special. So we started a conversation, started moving forward. I learned that he was a voracious reader of the research. He's been applying that. So while those of us in the sports science world, and we're talking global, Australia and Spain and Scotland and Europe, and I presented and met and know a lot of these colleagues of mine around the world, we've talked about this next level stuff, but we don't have many people who've been able to translate it. And in my own backyard, we had somebody who did. Well, with very few sessions, yes, Ethan got stronger. Yes, he improved on other parts of strength and conditioning. But with very few sessions, my son then went to lacrosse practice, and he said, everything slowed down for me. And that said a lot to me. So fast forward, I realized there was something special, and there was something that we thought was very important. And so as a university person, and the relationship we've developed, continually talk about this professionally, I thought it was very important to bring this to practitioners and professionals in the field. And so that's really what today is going to be about. But to be clear, the real goal for this seminar is what I call an extended paradigm of movement training. Whereas there are new things that we would recommend that come out of this seminar, that we would hope you'd want to embrace and use in your respective settings. I'm not necessarily saying that we quit lifting weights and we change everything that we do. There's a lot of things that you know and love and have experience with that are really good for what they do. But you don't take a Ferrari off-roading. You build a Jeep to go off-road. And you don't put a Jeep on a racetrack. Things have certain specialties. So you use what you use for what you need to use it for. So if you just are in a weight room getting people bigger and stronger, you're missing out on other aspects. You may have great tires on the Ferrari, but it's not going to go off-road well. Not that you want to. So our goal is we want to extend your paradigm, broaden your frame of reference, and broaden your thinking. That's the overall goal. And specifically, we have some planned takeaways. First of all, I do want to spend some time just talking about training, because I think in terms of physical development, athletes, that we may have some perceived notions that somehow today's athletes are so much better than 100 years ago. I'll talk about that. Another thing we want to talk about, determine how perceptual and learning theory, yes, we got to get into theory because theory is what the professionals are talking about that we can apply to practice. So how perceptual and learning theory contributes to effective movement with athletes. Where does that play a role? We want to add to your current knowledge. So hopefully by 4 o'clock today when you're done and you're out of here, you'll have a different set of knowledge or an added to your knowledge base that you didn't have to make it worthwhile. We want to give back to you for your time that you've had in here today. I want you to understand the complexity of advanced random athletic movement. Now, I know we use the word reactive athletic movement, but RAM training is a vehicle to improve reactive athletic movement. So that's why it's not a typo there. That's actually a piece there. I want you to know why RAM training can help mitigate non-contact injuries. There are certain things that happen, particularly early season injuries, that might help to be mitigated if, in fact, we engage in RAM training. There's reasons for that we will discuss. And I want you to be able to plan, or at least have a formula to think about how you can do this within your setting. And I want you to consider where, as a group, very cutting edge, about maybe becoming a RAM specialist, which we'll talk about at the end of the seminar. So sound good? Ready to move forward and get some of these new things will be done? Good. So that's why you're here. So I think it's important as we move forward that I set you up with some focusing points, some things to think about as we go through all this information. First of all, I use the phrase simply complex. Those of us who get doctoral degrees learn a whole lot about very little. The things that we're very interested in learning about, we tend to take something that seems very simple on the front end, but when you dive in, it gets incredibly complex. I mean, something as simple as, say, a bicycle. If you ever tried to build a bicycle from scratch, you realize how complex something as simple as a bicycle could possibly get. Well, we want to explore that. So the concepts that we're giving you, I've got to give you a little bit of a caveat in that we will teach you a good bit today, but in the 3-hour period, there's only so much we can cover. You'll get enough to be dangerous, but be prepared to know that you're going to have to work and move forward if you really want to do this well. We see people who get the general concept simply, no big deal, some random movements will put people out there, and then they train people to that, and they're getting some results, but where they could go is just not there yet. And they say, oh, I've got it. Well, they don't. They have some information. It's kind of like I would know how to do a heart transplant, take the heart out, put a new one in. Well, that's great. There's a lot more to it than that. Okay. Second thing is, I want you to understand that reactive movement training is not tactical coach training. We are talking about, in this seminar, movement training. So we're talking about taking an athlete and allowing them to be better movers. We will talk about things such as constraints, and there is some nonlinear coaching techniques that some of you, soccer uses this a good bit, volleyball does some, where you put constraints on the learning path to generate new knowledge and new performance and new things. We're not talking about the tactical side here. So I want you to focus on the fact we're talking about how to teach people to be better movers. So when you're coaching them to be an outside linebacker and you tell them that you want to move a certain way to meet up with the defender, or if they are an attacking defender in soccer and you want them to position themselves so that the offensive can't get past and you want to be able to take the ball away when they're vulnerable to the ball, that when you tell them that their body's able to do what their mind wants to do and what they want to do for you. So movement. Focus on that. Also, you'll hear the word reactive movement training is not reactive training. What does that mean? There is a series of information you can find in the strength and conditioning literature about things like plyometrics and other exercises you can do that create reactive. It's a training technique that's used. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about reactive athletic movement training. All right, so bear that in mind. And then finally, cognitive dissonance. If you remember back to your college psychology days, cognitive dissonance is when someone has a schema or an idea about how something works. So let's say you're a young child and you know what a dog is and you know what they look like, and then suddenly a cat walks in the room. Well, the cat comes into your room and it looks different, acts different, sounds different than a dog does, and that cat then causes cognitive dissonance. You're like, whoa, what's going on here? And so that cat then has to be either assimilated, oh, that's just a funny looking dog, or you have to recognize it's a new cat. So as we move forward focusing, recognize that what we're talking about should give you a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Also later on we talk about the kids, we're going to put them into cognitive dissonance, and hopefully physical dissonance, which allows them to respond as well, comes into play. So that should set the scene for us to really get started. The last thing, one thing we're really going to do that I really want you to pick up coming out of here is you're going to get a formula. We can't, there's too many differences in our sports. We got volleyball, we got soccer, we got football, we've got straight, there's too many differences for us to tell you that every sport-specific thing that we do is going to be helpful. So we're going to give you a formula to think through this process, and then we're going to challenge you to be partners of ours as we go forward in helping to make this much more effective in the things that we do. All right, so let's talk history. Everybody likes history a little bit. There's some things that are interesting. Well, okay, Doc, if it works, why change? And I agree. We know that there are a lot of principles and things we do to get people stronger. We know there's a lot of things we do to develop certain aspects of our body and things like that. Why would we want to leave that? But the advent of modern strength and conditioning is a relatively new idea. It's only been since about 1978 when the National Strength Coaches Association was once formed. So in some of our lifetimes, this is when this whole thing happened. Now the National Strength and Conditioning Association, that was only formed in 1978 and really advanced out in there. I can tell you that the desire to change is a belief that anything outdated or overemphasized must be improved upon. There are some things, so it sounds like I'm contradicting myself. I told you earlier, there are some things that work. You don't have to abandon those. We know how to deal with muscular hypertrophy, for example. Those are not bad things. They work, but they need to be compartmentalized in their current perspective. They're not an answer to everything that we have. Later on, I'll present to you a problem that our approach tries to resolve. And so, there's a myth because we see faster times on the track, we see shot put thrown further, we see people hitting balls harder and doing these other things, that athletes have changed. But when we dig in a little bit further, they may or may not have changed that much. So let's consider some athletic comparisons here. So put this on, really look at it this way and think about this. So this is a 400-meter sprinter in 1912 and in 2012, I believe here, okay, or 2016 actually. So this was the winner here was 173 centimeters and 60 kilograms. That to 178 and 77 kilograms isn't that big a change, really, in the scheme of things. Moving on. We will see some that are. This is a marathon. Well, it's hard to read here because the picture's kind of blurry, but we have 120 pounds, we have 88, we're back to 112. These are different time frames that these happen from 63 and moving up, but the marathoners got bigger and got smaller and got changed. It wasn't that they just got magically better or that we developed them in some whole new way. They haven't changed that much when you really get down to it. Now, in some areas, such as shot put, we do see change. In the early part of last century, the best athletes were those that, if you look at a normal curve, kind of fit the middle of the normal curve. We consider that the healthiest people. The people that were too tall, too muscular, too this, that kind of stuff on one end, or too weak and too thin on the other, weren't considered really athletic. Too small, too short, that kind of stuff. So we tend to gravitate it at that time to those people who were indeed average as more than one. So you saw shot putters that were about the same size as sprinters and other things like that. Over time, we specialized a bit more. Not that people changed, people who do it have changed a little bit. We'll talk more about that in a second. But some changes, maybe more or less. Here's basketball. That, of course, changed. But then we can look at things such as the marathon. Look at that. There's only a few centimeters, 3 centimeters difference in the exact same weight from 1896 to 2016. So athletes really have not changed that much. So what has changed? Most of the changes we have is the sport itself. Over time, people have more access to sport. There are more people, instead of a select few, who could actually do sport. There are more people who have the opportunities now to focus on a sport and get support for that and not have to work other jobs or worry about health issues or other things like that. Self-selection to specific sports or positions has increased. Shot putters who are bigger and stronger, when they go out for track, they tend to lean towards shot put. People who are shorter and smaller tend to go towards gymnastics, more compact bodies. We self-select in these positions, even on a football team, into our positions. Our coaches help, but we tend to self-select. Nutrition and health knowledge has increased. So yeah, and what I mean by that is not just by better nutrition, we're just naturally that much bigger, that we're just that much have evolved, because humans haven't evolved, but we are healthier. We tend to know that there are certain things that are good for us or not. There was a time that some people believed that drinking vinegar or high-proof alcohol cleansed your body and was good prior to running long-distance races. We know a little bit better than that now. There was a time when some people suggested that drinking too much water flooded your body too much and you had to learn how not to get body so you could perform better. There was a time when running long distances overstressed your heart and could cause heart problems. These were beliefs and things that we have. So we've gotten a little better on some of these topics here. So then, strength and conditioning training and our knowledge, and those of us who are exercise science experts have improved in those areas. So people really haven't evolved. People have self-selected in their sports, how we approach the sports. Oh, and I didn't mention things such as equipment. Jesse Owens was the premier runner in his day, sprinter. Usain Bolt was a premier sprinter in his day. If you looked at their times from 1936 to when Usain Bolt ran, and you compared them, in that same race, Jesse Owens would be 8th place. If you put Jesse Owens, when we look at the biomechanical efficiencies, the way the muscles work in the legs, if you put them on the same surface with the same equipment, the same shoes, Jesse Owens and Usain Bolt almost tie. We also have more people in the world participating in the sport. Kenyans didn't participate in the marathon until the 1950s, almost 1960. etc. So bear that in mind. We haven't changed. So we can do something as those of us who do that. So let's talk about a natural athlete. How many of you know natural athletes? You probably don't. I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics. And here's why we don't know that. We fall into a trap of the natural athlete, the intangibles. That person's special. And there are parts of that which are somewhat true, but those parts that are somewhat true are limited. What do I mean? It's true that if I want a 2-story house, I can't use a 1-story blueprint. Correct? DNA, genetics, that natural side of the house, those kind of things, is nothing more than a blueprint. We got people who look deep into DNA, and my colleagues will probably tell me. That's a blueprint. It will kind of dictate the end result. But once you start with that blueprint, let's say I got a 2-story blueprint and I want to build a house, and I go out and I try to build it. I'm a terrible builder. And I use poor materials, and I do it the poor way. That house isn't going to be something you would want to live in. A master builder, on the other hand, will probably take that same blueprint and do great things with it. Well, the same thing's true for us. Our DNA is a blueprint. It's not a guarantee. And so when you move forward, that line is not the same as the bottom line. Now, what do those lines represent? I didn't have a good way to represent it, so I had to use a line. The width of that line is one's ability. The longer the line, the greater your ability. Now, you may be born with this line, this ability. This might be it. How many of you in here are excellent concert violinists? None of you? How many of you could have been a concert violinist? Maybe one or more. You might have had this much potential. You never developed it. So there are certain things you never quite developed. Same thing's true with movement and other things. So this is potential. No, that's not the same as that, but the potential matters. We want to maximize the potential. What's interesting and noteworthy is that this might be your genetic potential, but most people don't ever reach that because they haven't had the proper training in that particular area. So hence, no concert violinists here. That's important to note. I'm going through this section with you guys to understand, to really drive home the point that we actually do teach people. We don't just play chess pieces on a board or chess pieces on a field, moving people around to implement our offense and defensive schemes. We teach. We can actually teach the person how to develop and move. All right, so how do we build this athlete? The idea of just a natural athlete, yes, some people have blueprints to be a little taller, a little bigger, I get that. But most people never get there. How do we then take what we got and build the athlete into what they're going to be? Well, it comes down to neurons. You can have strong muscles, strong bones, and those kind of things. We know. We see those big, strong kids. They can't move worth a darn. They have no skill. They just don't have it. It's just not there. It comes down to this little booger right here, the neuron. These are important parts. So you can see on the neurons that we have some important elements here. We have these little finger-like parts coming off here. These are known as dendrites. And if you remember back to your biology, you recognize that dendrites are important because that's where signals come in. They go through here, they go down the axon, and then they innervate with other nerves or muscular unit, those kind of things. That's how signals travel. Here's what we know. When we're born, we have lots and lots and lots of nerve cells. We know that in early childhood, by experiencing the world, through affordances and differences and other things, that those neurons fire and they work and they develop and they grow. And the more stimulus and experiences we have, the more dendrites are formed, the more other parts that we'll show you in a second happen, the better the signals travel, the better we're able to use our bodies and do the things we're supposed to do. That happens. We definitely see that. If you don't do that, it won't develop. Interestingly, by the time you're about 12 or 13, if you talk about your potential being this big, if you don't develop certain things, by the time you start hitting middle school, your body doesn't like to waste energy on things it's not going to develop. So nerves start pairing off. They start disappearing, dying, getting rid of. Your body doesn't need it anymore, so it doesn't do that. If you don't develop certain things as you're training, then some of the dendritic development, some of these other things don't happen. So that needs to happen. So we want to train, we want to develop, we want to grow. I've got another picture here, still a nerve, just a different thing of it, that are kind of important. You can see moving down the nerve, the myelin sheath, this area right here. Now there, of course, there are different kinds of nerves. This is way beyond what we would talk about. But we've got these myelin sheaths. We've got these little openings right here, which allow signals to travel faster by jumping through these nodes of Ranvier, they're called. You got lots of dendrites up here, and you want to move all the way down to the terminal buttons down there to send signals. Why am I going through all this? Because the muscles can be strong, but if you don't have them working correctly in the right way and the right kind of things, it's not going to happen. When we train and teach people in movement settings, we develop this type of thing to occur. And if we do it right and we do it well, then my last nerve here, am I getting on your nerves yet? Bad joke. Okay, then they jump, the signal passes, and ultimately it connects us into the neuromuscular junction. It would be another lecture and a lot of discussion to really explain, but I want you to take this away. Genetics are important. They're a blueprint. We have to train, provide affordances, provide opportunities, because we're only going to develop the things we do. And even think of it like this. If we don't really expand how we train people to move, it's kind of like doing muscle contractions and only going to short range of motion. We want the full range of motion, we want the flexibility, we want those things to be in a place to get all that we can out of that. Well, same thing's true for this as well. We want to teach people how to move. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's not as simple as just saying the nerves alone are the only answer. It's just part of the equation, but I wanted you to understand that, in fact, you do make a difference and you do affect learning, and it does happen. So then we get into theory, and I'm good with time. I told you I'm hitting you with a lot of stuff today. It's a lot to think about. That's by design, okay? If I don't get you thinking, put you in some cognitive dissonance, and I haven't done my job. And after I do all this, then I get to turn it over to the practitioner expert who's going to tell you what to do with it. So bear with me a little bit. Some of these are probably familiar to you more than others. Let's get a little more practical. I'm going to call Kim Atwood up here to talk about dynamical systems theory. She's looking at me funny. She's actually working on her doctoral dissertation using dynamical systems theory. As a little side note, I'll tell you a little bit about what she's doing. She actually took kids and wanted to see if we put them in an environment to teach them how to do an overhand throw. Okay, well, we know kids have a hard time throwing overhand. Sometimes it's a hard skill to teach for kindergarten, first graders. But the overhand throw. We know that if we put it too heavy of a ball, that it changes how they throw the ball. We know that if we put a target at a certain distance, it changes what they do with the ball. The constraints under that does that. So what she did is she took the kids out of the environment, taught them the movement pattern of the overhand throw out of context. There was no ball, there was nothing else. She taught the spatial and temporal motion of arm back, step, and follow through, almost like a dance. And she had the beat and everything to it. The kids did that. Now what's neat is decontextualized. Nothing with throwing a ball, but when she did put a ball back in the kids' hands, pre to post, the movement gain was as much as the kids who were taught traditional. Here's the ball, here are your learning cues, here's how you throw. Decontextualized, though, she wasn't constrained by the constraints. You ever see a kid do this with a basketball because it's too high, the ball's too heavy? Took the constraints away. So what was interesting, she came back a couple weeks later, tested the overhand throw again, looked at the qualitative performance that we want, good mechanical throws. Guess what? The kids who have been taught decontextualized still have a nice movement pattern. When you put a ball in their hand to throw at a target, those people who, they had a great pattern. The people who've been taught traditional, their performance, actually how they threw again, decreased dramatically. Well, that's just one example. Now, just a side note, because I thought it was pretty fascinating, the results will be published soon. Decontextualized learning is a whole other topic. For those of you who want to involve it, we'll do that at some point in time. But we talked about dynamic systems theory. A lot of information here. And I put it in here so it's in your slides. I'm going to hit it, and then I'm going to break it down and simple for you because it gets a little confusing. Dynamic systems theory has emerged in the movement sciences as a viable framework for modeling athletic performance. From a DST or dynamic systems perspective, the human movement system is a highly intricate network of codependent subsystems, including respiratory, circulatory, nervous, skeletal muscle, perceptual, that are composed of a large number of interacting components, such as blood cells, oxygen molecules, muscle tissues, metabolic enzymes, connective tissue, and bone. Dynamical systems theorists claim that the number of biomechanical degrees of freedom of the motor system is dramatically reduced through the development of coordinated structures or temporary assemblages of muscle complexes. Got it? Ready to go on. How many different ways can our body move? How many different degrees of freedom and things can we do? right? A lot of different ways. When people were trying to figure out how different motor patterns connected to the variety of different performances that we needed to do in an athletic setting, there was a problem. We can't train our body to do enough set motor patterns. One for kicking the ball this way, one for kicking the ball this way, one for kicking the ball that way. It just doesn't work. So theorists started looking at how the muscles and the body work together to pull the degrees of freedom in the muscles and the bones and all the components together to work in a coordinated system where there could be some variation in the movement based on how those self-organizing coordinated systems work. Sometimes the environment evokes these changes. For example, if you're on a treadmill and we keep speeding it up, you'll go from a walk to a jog to a run. You'll have these phase shifts. Things will happen. Your body coordinates from the environment. Sometimes when you're trying to accomplish things, you coordinate those things together. And that's the essence of dynamical systems theory, is this idea that coordinative structures work. And it allows for novel or relatively novel movements to occur in a variety of settings. So when we got all these degrees of freedom, if we put them in self-organizing groups together, the reduced dimensionality and complexity of the motor system encourages the development of functionally preferred coordination or attractor states to support goal-directed actions. I'm going to skip down to the last sentence there because that's the most salient. Indeed, variability in movement behavior permits performers to explore tasks and environmental constraints. What the environment allows us to do, what's within us, how strong we are, how flexible we are, that's within us. It allows us to explore these constraints in order to acquire stable motor solutions, the movements we have to make to accomplish our goals, over time and to enhance motor learning. So that's when we're dealing with dynamic systems theory. That's a big takeaway there. So that's one thing that we need to have occur. Bernstein captures some of these together. Bernstein's one of the big guys, one of the big developers, some foreign dude that put all this together. And he talked about that change is nonlinear and it's discontinuous. He talked about that change in terms of how we move is self-organizing. He talks about change being governed by affordances. That means opportunities and stimulus and opportunities in the environment affect that, and constraints, things that prevent certain things from happening. So that governs change. Change is transactional. You're working within a setting and an environment. And change involves, of course, degrees of freedom that we want to coordinate together. So as we move forward, you got to understand that dynamic systems theory plays a role in why some of the things we propose should and does work. Those of us in the global community who have been trying to figure out this intangible thing, but trying to figure out how people move well over here, and this is one of the pieces of the puzzle that drives in. Now let's talk about conceptual thresholds, and let's really get down here to a coaching thing. Let's say you got, I used an outside linebacker earlier, I used an outside linebacker now. You got an outside linebacker, you're a coach. You like playing chess, and what I mean by that, and I'm guilty as charged, is you like to have your offensive and your defensive schemes, and you like to put the person out there, and you like to have them execute a certain way. So you tell ex-athlete out here, okay, I want you to do these things and do it this way when you're reading this person over here to do what they're doing. So you're reading and you're responding a certain way. That person doesn't do it. That person can tell you what they want to do, they can repeat what they say, they're trying their best, but they're just not getting there. Well, my original strategy was to say, nah, they haven't got it, next person in. And I keep trying to find that athlete that's going to fit in that hole and try to do that. Well, I might have the strongest, best athlete in that position who isn't yet ready to do that move because perhaps they haven't increased either a movement threshold or a conceptual threshold to be able to do that movement. So they're not defying me. They're not dumb. They're not those kind of things. They need to have their movement training fit in with what I want them to do so that then they have the capacity to, in fact, do the movements and be successful in that regard. So conceptual threshold is that piece where not just thinking about, not just knowing it, but where the whole body and mind work coupled together to be able to generate the movement because it's the full understanding of how the body and mind are working to get that movement done a certain way, to read that the right way, to see that move the right way. I can tell you this, and I'm kind of doing a foreshadowing. But if you put cones on the ground and you have people just run here, here, and here, or they're just stepping on a ladder, there are things that can do. And I'm not taking that away from you. There are things that can do, but it's limited. Because that's the only movement repertoire that you have. You got to help people develop a bigger repertoire to be able to respond to what's in the environment, to be able to do it a certain way. If you only rely on scrimmage and games to develop that, you might see that movement or that experience once or twice. Repetition, we know, is important. So one of the hardest things, and we'll get into this later, I'm foreshadowing, one of the hardest things to do to be effective reactive movement trainers is to be able to create situations where people get lots of repetition by seeing those novel things that they might see once or twice in a game, and be able to develop it enough so that it is part of their conceptual thresholds as they move forward. That's the challenge. That's where theorists have had a hard time getting to practice, and that's why we're so lucky that I fell into somebody in my backyard who knew what was going on. When a conceptual threshold is reached, a priori decisions about movement can be stimulated. So then we can actually do those novel movements. Our self-organizing properties can come together. We can accomplish certain things, but we need to train for that in a non-static situation. So that's why I say it's a partner to self-organizing structure, because the bodies might move and respond, and there are certain things that have to happen, but once we cross those conceptual thresholds, we'll see that thing. So that's another theory that brings into where we're going. And so now I want to talk a little bit about nonlinear pedagogy. Historically, we teach this way. Here's how you throw a ball. Hand, back, step, follow through. We give learning cues. 2 or 3 different learning cues, things that are going to happen to create a learning result. We like that. It's comfortable, it's easy, it's familiar. We might put people in lots of practice. We gave them some learning cues that we can give them feedback on. You didn't get your arm back. You didn't get your arm back. You didn't get your arm back. We tell them over and over and over again. They're still not getting their arm back. You're frustrated with them. You assess them the wrong way. These things happen. Nonlinear pedagogy approaches it a little bit different. Almost Miyagi's, if you remember Karate Kid to some degree. Not exactly like that, but it's not a bad thing. Humans are complex systems whose movements and actions emerge under constraints. We can tell people what to do unless we create a situation. In Kim's instance, we decontextualized. But unless we create a situation that really calls for that particular movement or that thing to happen a certain way, it's not going to. Just telling somebody alone gets limited results. You'll get some, but it gets limited results. So we facilitate by creating constraints. Variety is important for adaptive movement situations. If you do the same thing over and over and over again, you get the same thing over and over again. So variability in nonlinear pedagogy is an important piece to include in your repertoire of what you do. Skill learning involves the forming of information and movement components. That's a conceptual threshold, the other piece we have. Knowing and understanding and movement, and the body has to work in conjunction, because you can't separate the mind and the nerves and the muscles into individual pieces. They've got to work together. They've got to organize and work and execute that way. Then you can talk about tactics and strategy to a whole new level, because they've got a big repertoire of their abilities. Simplification is an important part of constraint development. Attention capacity. Here's what I want to talk about with this. This is an important bullet for you to really grab a hold of in terms of your focusing point. Simplification. There's only so much we can attend to. If you are working with an athlete, regardless of their age or their ability, that kind of stuff, and you are putting them in a situation where either the constraints, the individual, or what you're asking them to do is not clear enough for their body, so what you're asking them to do, or their mind to process it, they cannot attend to it. So you may give them learning cues, you may give them a task, you may give them experience, but their body can't attend to that. They can attend to only a few things at a time, actually only one thing at a time, but they can only flip and flop and work in a certain way. So simplification in terms is an important step in nonlinear pedagogy. And I'm not talking simply. I'm talking about putting them in a place that others might say, meet them where they are. Put them at the level that they're at. Set the situations for where they need to be so they can move forward. Next one, prescribe a task, maybe a problem, not a movement, the solution. Don't just tell them the correct movement. Facilitate by creating problems, because then their learning gains and their improvements will be much more dramatic. Learning is demonstrated by doing. How good they are is a function of what they're able to do once they're done learning. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or performance over time. Relatively means like if you had a dire accident like a TBI or something like that, prevent it. Other than that, once you own it, you own it. That's learning. And then it takes time to reach optimum results. Repetition. You can't put somebody in the scrimmage, have them experience a novel event one time, and hope that it shows up effectively and efficiently on game day. We got to create a situation where that happens more regularly. Again, at this point, just to bring you up to speed and kind of hone you back in, we're just talking theory and perspective and things that drive what we know. And then we get down into Carl Newell, been around sometime, 70s-ish, where we get into this idea of constraints. You hear the word constraints a lot. Constraints learning approach. And I've brought that up and alluded to it quite a few times. So there are basically three areas of constraints. You have the individual, you have the task, and you have the environment. And we will work within these constraint ideas to talk about how movement can allow things to happen. So the organism, the task, and the environment. The task is something that's created, what we're asked to do. The environment is something physical in which we live. The organism is within the person. Now I like this diagram only because it shows how those of us who sometimes kind of work in our own little silos, how we actually complement each other for this overall movement pattern, where these constraints working together help formulate self-organizing and inter-individual coordinated structures, which allow for coordinated patterns, which allow for control patterns, which allow for that ultimate performance outcome we want to have happen. I want you to grasp the concept that by creating and manipulating constraints with predicted outcomes, I'm leading up to the formula you're going to get later, helps achieve the goals within which we want to accomplish. All right, so here's a problem. Here's a problem that we like to think about, that we worry about. Why do some very strong athletes fail to perform well in their sport? We see them. They are a physical specimen. When I say very strong, I kind of capture it that way. But they're a physical specimen. They should be able to do X, X, and X. They look athletic. They seem athletic. They have these kind of things. Why can't they do what we want them to do? What's the problem there? Why is there not a clear transfer from closed agility drills to player performance? Have you ever seen that kid in shorts in the combine that comes out that could do the moves, the 5-10-5, the L drills, and maybe even throw and do all these kind of things, but then it doesn't translate to performance? What's missing there? That's a problem. That's something that we've been trying to resolve. Why do some people seem to have intangible skills that allow them to predict and respond in meaningful ways when others who you know are stronger, taller, faster, maybe smarter, how can this other person do it so much better? Natural athlete, they just got it. They got that skill. Let's recruit that person, put them on the team. That's it. That's the person. Well, I challenge you to think that those intangible skills we've started to identify, and we can train those. And that's what we are hoping to do with this. Those people who have the intangible skills seem to have some certain commonalities. When you look at them perform, they tend to already begin, if you look in slow motion, they're already beginning to make the moves before the other person even almost knows how to make the moves. They put themselves in the right position. They can see things and do things because they've been there before. And so that's an important step. That's why, I don't have to be the fastest person. I'm not going to steal your line. I don't have to be the fastest person, and he can just go say it again and say it better. But if I'm at the right place at the right time. So anyhow, so that's important. That's trainable. Not just from a tactical standpoint. Remember the focusing point, not just from a tactical standpoint, but from a movement standpoint. That's important. Another problem. Why is it so difficult to teach some people to perform well, especially when they have demonstrated above average physical abilities? Okay, so we say it's trainable. Well, okay, John, well, that's great. I can train it. How come some people just don't get it? Well, they have to, remember I just said, they got to meet where you're at. They will develop. Trust that development. Have a, progress and work through that. But that's another problem we have to consider. It's out there. And then last one, I got to throw this in here. And I want to talk a little bit about this. Why does there seem to be so many preseason or early season injuries? let's think about this. All preseason long, and we're starting to see some changes. We're starting to see some people do a little bit of reactive or random movement training. I'm going to comment on those two things first before we get to a break. If I spend all summer just stepping over, running here to this cone, cutting this cone and doing that over and over again, I have lots of repetitions at doing that move. On a cone that's still, doing that kind of stuff. So I've developed this tendency, this pattern, this habit, these other things that my body is wanting to do. I've actually created my own constraint. I got really good at a very narrow bandwidth of things. Well, in a game, that might work, but also might not work based on what is happening in the game around me. So we'll sometimes see people who their bodies and everything are conditioned and to do one thing, but then the environment calls for them to do something different, and their body tries to make that adjustment, and guess what? Injuries start to occur. That's why you get better settled in the season and some other things happen. Well, from a coaching standpoint, it would be great if we could help get ahead of that curve from a movement standpoint, not just a tactical, not just other stuff, from a movement standpoint before that piece happens. So arguably, by expanding the repertoire of the ability of one to adapt to novel movements and to make those changes, we might actually be able to decrease injuries. And in fact, I believe that's true. There's more to that than this piece right here. So, deep breath, John. Keep calm. It's break time. Don't rush off yet. We're going to talk for a second. So that's kind of the background that sets the stage. I get to set everything up for KB to come on in a few minutes. He's going to continue the rest of today. What I'd like for you to do during this break time is to have a break, relax, breathe, network, and connect. But I'd also like you to kind of reflect on some of the focusing points and some of the topics we've had, and get ready to learn what to do with this information going forward. My question to you is a little bit of for myself, is have you, in this hour I've been talking to you, have you learned anything new? Raise your hand if you learned anything new. Nothing new. Okay. Raise your hand if I've stimulated any different kind of thinking for you so far. Okay. Raise your hand if you're really excited to hear what's coming up in the afternoon. That's even better. Okay, good.